Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for joining another Issues on the Impossible online session. Today, it's my pleasure to have Jessica Wilson from the University of Toronto here. Jessica is going to talk about metaphysical skepticism and relativized metaphysical modality. Jessica, please.
Great. Thank you for the invitation to speak at your series, Martin, and thank you to everybody else and for attending. So let's start by considering some metaphysical claims, just some standard metaphysical claims, such as that any collection of objects has a mereological sum. Another one, that universals provide a basis for resemblance between objects. Or, for example, that sets exist and are governed by such and such axioms. So what I want to do in this talk today is consider and respond to certain variations on the theme of a concern about such claims, according to which our operative metaphysical methodology provides equal support for incompatible such claims as a result of what I would call methodological over-determination. You might think that there's also a route to metaphysical skepticism that proceeds by way of methodological underdetermination, where you just don't have the resources to arrive at any answer one way or another. But here, the concern is that, our research resources are, in fact, up to the task of providing some motivations for this or that metaphysical claim. But unfortunately, those same resources seem to make room for an incompatible such claim. So the basic concern here is that metaphysical claims in general are supposed to be strongly modally stable. So they are necessary or impossible in the broadest, not merely syntactic sense, as usual with metaphysical claims. And yet these cases can be made that incompatible metaphysical claims are each metaphysically possible, hence each is metaphysically necessary, and in particular, each is actual, problematically. So I want to offer two strategies of response to this sort of metaphysical skepticism. And the first is to resist the implication that, in fact, there's equal support for incompatible metaphysical claims. So here the idea is that once certain problematic assumptions about metaphysical modal deliberation or methodology are relaxed, and here I'm drawing on work, especially with Stephen Biggs, so we've written a series of papers on this topic. Once we relax those problematic assumptions, we'll see down the line what they are, according to which the methodology might, in this case, favor one metaphysical claim over another. So the idea here is that there might be, in fact, routes to arriving at a preferred metaphysical claim and ruling out, or at least pushing aside, the seemingly the incompatible such claims. So that's resistance. And the other is to accommodate at least the sort of intuitive considerations that appear to support the methodology giving rise to sort of equally supporting incompatible metaphysical claims. So this would be a form of accommodation. And here the idea is that you can accommodate the intuitive considerations in support of incompatible metaphysical claims, each being possibly true, by taking metaphysical modality to be relativized. So here I'm drawing work that I originally was collaborating with Adam Murray, and now Ben Hellie and I and Adam have also been developing this view. On this view, certain general metaphysical claims, just like certain claims, as Kripke has arguably taught us, certain claims about natural kinds may be sensitive to facts about the actual world. And so I think an interesting upshot of this line of treatment of methodological overdetermination concerns about metaphysics, really, or modal metaphysics, is that it opens a new category, a new general category of a posteriori necessities, and the possibility that, as on anti-exceptionalist approaches to logical theory choice, according to which sort of empirical facts might in fact enter into our choice of which logic to accept. Similarly, metaphysical theory choice may be sensitive to actual empirical considerations. So here in the paper towards the end, I'll develop this strategy a bit, considering what it would take to discover that the actual world is some way which bears on what is metaphysically the case. And I'm going to suggest that this methodology, which we have called moderate modal naturalism, makes good sense of philosophers actually quite often, appealing to empirical considerations in contemporary metaphysical debates. And then a related upshot is that we can and should extend the notion of an a posteriori necessity beyond claims about natural kinds or artifacts to apply more generally to metaphysical claims. So that's the strategy. So let's start by putting some of these overdetermination concerns on the table. So I'm going to just discuss three sort of paradigmatic cases in point. The first is Chalmers' conceivability argument. So in his 2009, he offers what he calls a conceivability argument for ontological anti-realism. And this is the view that there are no objective answers to metaphysical questions about what really exists. So, for example, as regards the claim that any two entities have a mereological sum as per universalism, and the claim that any two entities never have such a sum as per nihilism, he says the following: if there is a non-defective absolute quantifier, then both nihilism and universalism are conceivable. Neither of them can be reduced to contradiction by a priori reasoning. But what cannot be ruled out a priori is possible, setting aside Kripkean phenomena that are irrelevant here. Nihilism and universalism are not both possible, so there is no non-defective absolute quantifier, unquote. Okay. So now, as Chalmers admits, the argument he's just given there needs filling in. So here's how I fill it in. To start, the focus on a non-defective absolute quantifier will reflect, so that's kind of like the formal mode. If we move to the material mode, thinking about what's going on here, this focus on a non-defective absolute quantifier reflects the ontological realist commitment to the debates being substantive, as opposed to merely terminological. Okay. Now, that commitment, in turn, requires that the nihilist and the universalist each take their opponent's view to be conceivable, not obviously incoherent. But Chalmers maintains what is ideally conceivable is metaphysically possible. So, if the debate is non-terminological, both views are metaphysically possible. But the views can't be both metaphysically possible, since if a metaphysical claim is possibly true, then, so it is commonly assumed, I'll say a little bit more about this down the line, it is necessarily true, in which case contradictory claims would be true at every possible world, including ours. So Chalmers concludes from this that there is no non-defective absolute quantifier, and now if we again move from the formal to the material mode, this idea, the conclusion is that the metaphysical debates are themselves defective, since competing metaphysical claims will make sense only from within, if we think in Carnapian terms, from within distinct frameworks So you'll have your universalist framework, and then you'll have your nihilist framework. So those claims will make sense from within those frameworks, but there is no framework which can contain them both. So effectively, metaphysical dispute turns out not to really be genuine. No substantive metaphysical disputes are available. So this is Chalmers' neo-Carnapianism about ontological debate. Okay, so that's one representative of this kind of skeptical concern. Another emerges indirectly from Gideon Rosen's concern that there are, in fact, multiple notions of metaphysical modality. So again, it's commonly assumed that true metaphysical claims are metaphysically necessary, and that metaphysical necessity is necessity in the broadest, again, not merely syntactic sense, okay, the broadest interesting sense, really, metaphysically interesting anyway. In his 2006 paper, Rosen argues that this latter conception of metaphysical necessity is problematically ambiguous. So he says the following, quote, "The conception is consistent with two distinct conceptions of necessity and possibility. If this is right, then our working conception of metaphysical necessity is confused. Questions about metaphysical necessity are ambiguous, and where divergent resolutions of the ambiguity yield different answers, the modal question, as we normally understand it, has no answer," unquote. And Rosen illustrates with the case of resemblance and universals. Okay. So he says, quote, D.M. David Mallet Armstrong has long maintained that whenever two particulars resemble one another, this is because they share an immanent universal as a common part. So an Aristotelian conception of universals. Let us grant the coherence of the very idea of an immanent universal, wholly located in distinct particulars. In fact, let us grant that in the actual world, similarity works as Armstrong says it does. By the way, any latecomers, we might want to throw the handout in the chat again, just if people are coming in late. Continuing on with Rosen's discussion here, quote, "The question will then be whether it is absurd to suppose a world in which qualitative similarity between particulars is secured by some other mechanisms, e.g., a world in which similar particulars are similar because they contain exactly resembling tropes, or because they instantiate one or another primitive similarity relation," unquote. So if we suppose, cashing out what Rosen is saying here, if we suppose, as per the standard conception of metaphysical modality, that metaphysical claims are necessarily true, if true, or necessarily false, if false, then we must say that competing bases for resemblance are somehow absurd. So given that immanent universals are the basis for resemblance between particulars in the actual world, then these competing accounts of such resemblance or similarity must turn out to be absurd. But as Rosen observes, it's not plausible to deny that similarity might have worked by way of tropes rather than universals or in some other way entirely. As he says, if it walks, talks, and looks like similarity, it plausibly is similarity. But then in that case, there would seem to be a yet broader, non-standard conception of metaphysical modality, making room for all these metaphysical options. So Rosen doesn't himself draw a metaphysically skeptical conclusion from there being more than one conception of metaphysical modality. I mean, he does say that, we might be confused about this conception, but you can see a route to general skepticism here in the following way. So to start, if metaphysical claims express the natures of things as opposed to how they contingently are, then it really seems as if such claims must be necessary or impossible in the broadest sense. So I think when we are wondering why is it that metaphysical claims are usually supposed to be necessarily true, if true, necessarily false, if false, I think this ultimately stems from the supposition that metaphysics is, metaphysical claims are about the natures of things, and the natures of things are such that they can't change from world to world. So we, are committed to metaphysical claims being necessary if true, and so on. And in this sense, metaphysics is supposed to be distinctive. But if for any given metaphysical claim, or pretty much any one can think of, it appears that different conceptions of metaphysical necessity will disagree on the modal status of that claim. Okay, so there's a kind of indeterminacy here, and depending on how you're going to treat this indeterminacy, where you have different truth values associated with these different conceptions, you might say, well, then either every metaphysical claim is going to turn out to be false, or else you might claim it's just going to be neither true nor false. Either way, that would be problematic from a metaphysical point of view. You might wonder, well, can I get around this problem by just committing to one or the other of these conceptions? But, it looks like either way you go, that's going to be problematic. If you go for the standard conception, then that will accommodate the supposition that if, for example, universals are the basis for resemblance, then this is necessarily so. So it accommodates the idea that metaphysical claims are about the natures of things. But since the non-standard conception remains as a yet broader conception of necessity, metaphysical claims then turn out to have the same status as, for example, scientific claims, which are usually thought to be only restrictedly necessary. And so in that case, it seems like they're not really about natures. The non-standard conception, if you accept that one as your sort of the preferred account of metaphysical modality, that would vindicate the distinctive status of metaphysical claims as unrestrictedly necessary, but at the cost of rendering few, if any, paradigmatically metaphysical claims metaphysically necessary. Okay, so that's Rosen's a second kind of route to metaphysical skepticism based in this kind of methodological overdetermination. And then I'll just briefly mention Clarke-Doane's, what he calls post-metaphysical modality. So he asked in his 2019 paper, what is uniquely metaphysically significant about metaphysical necessity? And his answer is nothing. His primary strategy then, again, and I think he's perhaps the most explicit of these three representatives about the idea that our methodology for arriving at metaphysical claims, it can be seen as generating incompatible such claims. So his primary strategy is to argue that our usual modes of epistemic access to the truth of modal claims, which he considers in particular conceivability, counterfactual assessment, and the recognition of absence of defeaters. He looks at those procedures, and he makes his case that these will provide equal support for both a given metaphysical claim P and its negation. And he goes through several cases. For example, he illustrates by attention to the claims that sets exist and are governed by such and such axioms. And he concludes that, quote, the grounds that we actually advance for judging that paradigmatic metaphysical possibilities are possible seem to serve equally to show that at least some paradigmatic metaphysical impossibilities, namely the negations of the axioms of pure mathematics, are too, unquote, are also possible. So he also, like Chalmers ends up by drawing deflationary, broadly Carnapian implications of such modal pluralism about metaphysical claims. Okay, so those are, the sort of concerns that we're actually seeing quite a lot of these days. So I want to now go forward with my responses. And again, my first response is resistance, okay? So according to these overdetermination-based concerns, leading to metaphysical skepticism, applications of certain methodologies equally support a given metaphysical claim, P, for example, that immanent universals are the basis for resemblance between particulars, and its negation, some incompatible such claim, such that, e.g., tropes are the basis for resemblance between particulars. And my response here involves noting first that these concerns typically suppose that something like conceiving or intuition or related procedures, for example, counterfactual assessment, those are the operative guides to metaphysical possibility, right? And what I want to observe is that one can resist that supposition, okay? That we must rely on conceiving or rational intuition or related sort of procedures in arriving at metaphysical claims. So why is it usually assumed that conceiving or rational intuition or associated procedures are the operative methodology for such claims? Well, I speculate, I think it's plausible that people have thought that modal metaphysical reasoning has to proceed via an a priori mode of inference. Okay, what do I mean by that? An a priori mode of inference will be one whose epistemic value is a priori. Of course, if you operate with an a priori mode of inference on some a posteriori data, the conclusion will be a posteriori, but that would be true of modus ponens as well. But the idea here is that the epistemic value of the procedure itself needs to be a priori. And it has been very commonly assumed that while conceiving or intuition, et cetera, are a priori in this sense, abduction is not. Abduction or inference to the best explanation is not. Okay. But Biggs and Wilson, Stephen Biggs and I have argued in a series of papers that contrary to this common assumption, abduction is a priori. Its epistemic value is, in fact, a priori. And interestingly, there are some historical precursors here that are, if I'm going to appeal to an argument by authority, I like having these guys in my court, namely Kant and Carnap. So Kant's notion of the synthetic a priori involves abductive reasoning and is also a priori. And Carnap's notion of explication, even though, of course, he's anti-metaphysical in his way, that's fine, be that as it may. And he also is giving a pragmatic spin to what he calls this kind of explication where we fill in our concepts. Nonetheless, he is in fact implementing something like abduction as a way of as part of what he calls conceptual analysis, a priori conceptual analysis. So the considerations that we raise in support of the epistemic values of abduction being a priori are many and various, some positive, some defensive, and so on. But I just will say that the short story here is that the ceteris paribus clauses in abductive principles operate to shield them from empirical disconfirmation. So if you actually look at the kind of scenarios that are supposed to support taking the epistemic value of abduction to be a posteriori, where you perform an IBE given some data and you infer to the simplest theory, simplest overall, ... along with the other considerations of the other theoretical virtues and so on. Then you get some new data, and the new data undercuts your previous conclusion. Those are best understood, we argue, as cases where you were just initially operating on incomplete data. And because you have these ceteris paribus clauses, it turns out you were wrong that everything was equal as between the competing explanations of the data. So that doesn't show that abduction is a posteriori. It's compatible with abductions being a priori, that those kinds of scenarios are the case. And then we have these additional sort of positive reasons for thinking of abduction as a priori. Okay. So if we are right that abduction is a priori and thus is suited for metaphysical modal deliberation, this is going to transform the space of what is genuinely possible. So even if it is in fact conceivable, both that universals serve as a basis for resemblance at a world, and it's conceivable that tropes serve as a basis for resemblance at a world, well, abduction might, in fact, come into play to support one of those options over the other. Okay. And similarly, we suggest for other incompatible metaphysical claims. Okay. That work has not been done, but the point is just that we can, the conceivability alone that will be part of the data upon which an abductive modal epistemology will operate, would take that into consideration. So, for example, with respect to the possibility of zombies, it's data that we seem to be able to conceive zombies, but that's not the only data that we will operate on, on the way to considering whether zombies are in fact genuinely metaphysically possible. We'll also take into account, for example, the dictates of our best theories, or what is most systematic to say, or what the other implications and desiderata in the vicinity of that claim are. Okay, so the conceivability alone doesn't make it the case that each of these is genuinely possible, metaphysically possible. Okay, so that's the line of resistance. So this potentially offers one potential means of blocking this overdetermination route to metaphysical skepticism. So now I want to turn to a second strategy of response, accommodation. Okay, so now let's suppose in the remainder of this discussion that nothing, including abduction, legislates a priori in favor of one metaphysical claim over the competing alternatives. So we bring our abductive resources to bear on the question of what might serve as the basis for resemblance between particulars. But at the end of the day, none of the competing metaphysical claims is clearly favored. Then what? Well, in this past work, which I mentioned earlier, me, Adam Murray, Ben Hellie have been working on this sort of thing. We argue that the very common supposition that metaphysical possibility and necessity are absolute or absolute notions, argue that is incorrect. So the idea that there's just this one space of possible worlds, what's metaphysically possible is what's true in all of those worlds, was metaphysically in some of those worlds was metaphysically necessary is what's true in all of them, and that's that. We argue that that's too simple a view. It doesn't accurately reflect what we take to be the complex structure of metaphysical modality. Okay, rather we suggest that what is metaphysically possible or necessary should be understood as relativized to what we call an indicatively actual world, okay, as per this view, which we call relativized metaphysical modality, RMM. So to get a feel for what we're suggesting with relativized metaphysical modality, you can think of it as a kind of metaphysical repurposing of two-dimensional semantics. So probably a lot of you are familiar with the kind of epistemic two-dimensionalism that has been advanced by Chalmers, Jackson, Chalmers, and so on. And more generally with this kind of two-dimensional semantic apparatus, which has been used fruitfully to illuminate a number of issues in both philosophy of language and epistemology. So what are the two dimensions? The two dimensions reflect this distinction that is partly due to Davies and Humberstone and partly due to Jackson, which distinguishes between two different ways to consider a world, right? And what the goings on in those worlds or what our terms refer to in that world and so on. So on the one hand, you can consider a world as actual, and in this two-dimensional framework, that's reflected by this vertical dimension, or you can consider a world as counterfactual, holding fixed one world as actual, and that's the horizontal dimension. Okay. So in philosophy, the familiar or traditional application of this two-dimensional apparatus is primarily epistemic, okay, per epistemic two-dimensionalism. And this was what's the motivation there is to regain post-Kripke a bunch of a priori access to modal truth. So, the story goes as Chalmers has nicely kind of advanced it. It's like, oh gosh, we used to think that modal space was accessible to us just a priori. But then Kripke came along and showed us that there were some a priori metaphysical necessities. So some of these metaphysical modality might all these metaphysical claims, it might turn out that they are in fact claims about natural kinds, for example, or artifacts. Turns out that they depend on this a posteriori investigation. So now what do we metaphysicians have to do? Do we have to wait until the end of empirical inquiry until the scientists tell us what is what? And Chalmers says, no, don't have to do that. Epistemic two-dimensionalism will provide a basis for regaining a great deal of a priori access to metaphysical modal truth, where basically what we have access to a bunch of conditionals in the first instance, conditional modal truth, such that, for example, we can know a priori that if the actual world is an H2O world, right, one where water is H2O, then that's going to be necessarily the case. And we can also know a priori that if the actual world is an XYZ world, then that's necessarily the case, and so on. So we still have a priori access to a bunch of modal truth, and then the only role for empirical investigation is in discharging the antecedent of conditionals which are known a priori. So I love that idea, and I think it's great. Biggs and I argue that the best way to implement that excellent idea is using abduction. Okay, so that's how these two projects actually interact in this way. Over in the E2D case, we have a paper, Abduction versus Conceiving in Modal Epistemology. So it turns out, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think given this audience, it's worth highlighting. turns out that a lot of the objections to epistemic two-dimensionalism, according to which, we don't really have access to the full space of, possible applications of our concepts, or concepts are somewhat indeterminate, or they conflict and stuff like that. They turn out, we argue, Stephen and I argue, they turn out to be objections to E2D, epistemic two-dimensionalism, when it's implemented using a conceiving-based modal epistemology. If you implement epistemic two-dimensionalism with an abductive modal epistemology, you can do things like fill in the extensions of your concepts, right, in a way that would be sensible, or you can overcome a lot of the concerns that are raised purportedly against E2D, but which are in fact then really concern. The real target is E2D plus a conceiving-based modal epistemology. So anyway, that's just to advertise that E2D, even though, come on, you can come in. I'm having some painting done upstairs. So you can implement E2D using an abductive modal epistemology and overcome a lot of the supposed concerns with E2D. Anyway, now on E2D, the modal patterns that are kind of encoded in the conditionals, right? If the actual world is an H2O world, then necessarily what is H2O? If the actual world is an XYZ world, then necessarily what is XYZ? Those modal patterns are characterized, the alternative ones to the actual world are characterized as merely epistemically possible, okay? Reflecting the aim of E2D. Okay, so its focus is epistemology, that's fine. But on relativized metaphysical modality, these patterns are taken to encode general metaphysical principles which register the dependence of how things can or must be on how things actually are, such that then its metaphysical modality itself is revealed to have a relativized structure. Okay. So that's kind of by way of heuristic sketching of RMM, right? And what, the idea is sort of a metaphysical take on E2D, so to speak, or the two-dimensional apparatus that's associated with E2D. But non-heuristically, we've developed it more formally as tracking a distinction between index, which tracks worlds considered as counterfactual and which is open to semantical control by operators, and context, which is tracking worlds considered as actual and which is not controllable by semantic operators, and is controllable only pragmatically by extra-linguistic context, as motivated by widespread rejection of David Kaplan's monsters. Okay, so what's a monster? In semantics, it's a context-shifting operator, okay, of the sort which generates infelicitous claims such as, for every person everywhere at any time, I am here now. Okay, so we argue that thinking of the vertical dimensions as actual world context, right, and the horizontal dimensions as index that are relativized to those contexts, this provides a framework where, as we'll see, you can kind of you can block the idea that there's a non-standard modality a la Rosen. Looking forward a little bit. Okay, so let me expand on how it is that if you accept RMM and this idea that metaphysical modality is in fact relativized to actual world or context, actual world context, it can accommodate the sort of intuitive lines of thought whereby incompatible metaphysical claims are in some sense each possible, compatible with taking metaphysical claims to be metaphysically necessary. So here is the idea. The idea is that metaphysical claims in general can be a posteriori necessities. Okay. Maybe not all of them are, but they can be. Some of these ones can be, in fact, understood as a posteriori necessities. So, for example, as regards the basis of resemblance between particulars or objects, then we'll have something that looks like this. Given that the actual world is one where such resemblance is based in immanent universals, then this is metaphysically necessary. But given that the actual world is one where such resemblance is based in tropes, then this is metaphysically necessary, and so on. Okay, so same pattern as is the case for natural kind claims, etc. So in response to Rosen, hi, come on in, it's fine. In response to Rosen, this approach preserves the standard conceptions thought that metaphysical claims are metaphysically necessary. So relative to our very own actual world, right? So we've got that is metaphysical necessity is relativized to our actual world. That's fine. Those claims, if it, in fact, the actual world is one where immanent universals are the basis for resemblance, and this is metaphysically necessary. Great. But it accommodates the intuitive conception motivating, or the intuitive thought motivating the non-standard conception that in some sense the negations of those metaphysical claims are possible. But that's going to be relative to a different and merely hypothetical world taken as actual. Okay. And here, in some sense, the idea that these alternative claims taken to different worlds considered as actual are, in some sense possible. This is crucial because context shifting operators, right, are impermissibly monstrous. They violate, Kaplan's prohibition on monsters. You cannot have context shifting operators. So you block that. There neither is, on this interpretation, there neither is nor can comprehensibly be any modal operator that controls relativity to worlds considered as actual. So you can't quantify over worlds considered as actual. And hence, there is no broader non-standard modality. Okay. The actual world, in fact, fixes the context. And in doing that, it fixes what is metaphysically possible and necessary. But we can hypothetically consider what would be possible, metaphysically possible or necessary, were another world to be actual. But note that possibility in light of such a false supposition cannot undercut what is in fact metaphysically possible and necessary. So, as in the case of standard a posteriori necessities of the sort that Kripke advanced and discussed, discharging the antecedent of the broadly conditional claims above, if the actual world is one where immanent universals are the basis for resemblance, then this is necessary. If tropes are the basis for resemblance, that's metaphysically necessary. So, discharging the antecedent of those conditional claims would require justified belief regarding what the actual world is like. So now remember, at this point in the dialectic, we're assuming that there's no, a priori barrier to universals being the basis for resemblance, and there's no a priori barrier to tropes being the basis for resemblance, abductively in particular. Those are, they both are fine. Neither wins. So given that we're assuming that, then the justification for one or the other metaphysical claims being actually true has got to be ultimately a posteriori. Okay. So again, maybe we can get there via, an a priori route, but at this point, we're assuming that that's not we can't do that. We can't figure out how the world actually is, metaphysically speaking, for some claims, metaphysical claims. Can't do it a priori, then it's got to be a posteriori. Now, whether we can, in fact, make such a posteriori discoveries, I think this is a good question. If all the metaphysical options do equally well at accommodating the actual facts, then we might not be in position to discharge any one of the given antecedents in the conditionals that are known a priori. However, points first, even so, relativized metaphysical modality will block taking such failures to generate incoherence and hence blocks metaphysical skepticism. So rather, our position will just be that of, for example, persons who, for whatever reason, are not in position to determine the ultimate chemical facts. And so at best, we can just know certain conditional facts about water's constitution. Too bad for us. We can only get to the conditionals and we can't discharge any antecedents, but that itself is not, that just says that there's going to be a kind of lower limit to the persistification of, realization of which metaphysical theories are true. Still conditional knowledge. There's a lot of knowledge still. And so maybe we can, maybe we can't. But you might think that on model of certain motivations, for example, for logical pluralist views or anti-exceptionalist views, where logical theory choice is not exceptional, it's just like scientific theory choice. On these kinds of views, certain scientific theories might support certain logics over others. Okay, so this Quine, was one of the first people to suggest that maybe quantum mechanics, if you interpret indeterminacy in a certain way, then, that might motivate an alternative non-classical logic. I don't think so, according to my account of metaphysical indeterminacy and quantum indeterminacy. You can accommodate quantum metaphysical indeterminacy in a way compatible with classical logic. But in any case, it's a view in good standing that there might be, empirical content might inform logical theory choice. And so we might think maybe the same is true for metaphysical theory choice in at least some cases. So the methodology here would encode what we have called moderate modal naturalism. So what I mean by that is just that actual empirical facts can and sometimes do contribute to determining which metaphysical claims are true and hence which metaphysical claims are metaphysically necessary. Excuse me. So it turns out that moderate modal naturalism is actually quite commonly operative in contemporary metaphysical debates. So to just give a couple of prominent examples, Sider, for example, argues that predurantism is motivated by special relativity. And Schaffer argues that monism, according to which the cosmos is the only fundamentum, is motivated by quantum entanglement. And then there are a bunch of related arguments that quantum physics undercuts one way or another Lewis's Humean supervenience. Okay, so these arguments presuppose that, the actual world being empirically a certain way supports one metaphysical theory over another. And they're also presupposing that if the empirical facts had turned out differently, that might have supported a different metaphysical theory. So, the actual scientific facts, had they been different, they might well have lent support to endurantism over predurantism or pluralism rather than monism. Okay. So relativized metaphysical modality and the notion of an a posteriori metaphysical necessity as an extension of Kripke's original applications to claims about natural kinds and artifacts provides a basis for making sense of how incompatible metaphysical claims may each be possible in a sense, and hence metaphysically necessary relative to different worlds considered as actual in a way which sidesteps metaphysical skepticism. So just to sum up by adverting to a kind of aside that Chalmers made in his own argument for ontological realism, contra what he assumed, Kripkean phenomena, so-called, turn out to be deeply relevant to understanding metaphysical modality and indeed to the vindication of metaphysics itself. So that's it. That's my talk. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for a fantastic talk. Okay, we have some time for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand either on the screen or in the Zoom. Mike.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that interesting talk. So I was just wondering, in the case of, so for the two-dimensional sort of strategy to work, some of these metaphysical terms have to be sort of twin earthable. And it seems that often they won't be. And whether a term is twin earthable depends on, for instance, whether there's a distinction between its primary and secondary intention, and one is usually got via like some sort of empirical discovery. So I guess you think that that's not true, for instance. So like terms about persistence, for instance, in the persistence case, will be influenced by, I mean, is it true that there has to be, in order for it to work in the metaphysics case, they have, like, if we're talking about whether predurantism or endurantism is true, then terms concerning persistence have to be empirically discoverable?
Let me just make sure I understand what you mean by it being twin earthable. So there has to be like a sense, so to speak, of the associated with the expression that can then be kind of filled in differently.
Yeah, so it's kind of indexical
by the context. So you have like the watery stuff, and then in this context, it picks out H2O, and the other one it picks out XYZ. Yeah. I think that's a nice question, and I think I am committed to that in the sense that, there has to be something like similarity, right? So similarity would be akin to like the watery stuff. So maybe the similarity role or something like that would be associated with that. I don't necessarily want to use the terminology of primary intention just because it's associated with the E2D stuff, but there's a kind of sense there that could then be filled in by context in this world, as Rosen was assuming, by immanent universals, or so that's the role player, so to speak. And in this other world, tropes, maybe something like that. Would that count as being twin earthable by your lights?
Maybe, yeah. So like also if you have a kind of view that like the meanings are sort of structural, sort of, but like so take universalism versus nihilism about composition. What in that case, how is the 2D strategy going to work there? Because
or mereological composition.
Yeah, for composite objects.
Yeah, good. So the idea would be
sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No. So what would happen, I guess, would be that in some worlds considered as actual, there would be composition, and in others there wouldn't be.
Yeah, but there would be no empirical discovery.
Oh, as far as getting
There-
an empirical discovery for
yeah,
that.
no empirical discovery would let us figure out whether or not there are composite objects or just things that are arranged
Well,
composite object
yeah.
wise or something.
Well, I think it depends again what methodology you're helping yourself to. I mean, I think that, for example, I mean, notwithstanding that I put at this stage of the dialectic, I'm putting aside abduction. Abduction will still abduction as a prior, we can think about abduction resulting in a conclusion that is a priori, and abduction that also operates on a posteriori evidence resulting in a posteriori conclusion. So in the second case, perhaps we would be able to, even if we couldn't a priori determine operating on a priori evidence, we couldn't arrive at one or the other as the only option, and hence the actual option. Perhaps operating on empirical evidence, abduction would motivate thinking that one or the other is better motivated or warranted. So it's not just a matter of looking, so to speak. You know what I mean? Like when Chalmers says, "Is there a fist here?" Or
Yeah.
how could we have any idea of what that would even, what would be the answer to that kind of question? What would basis for such an answer? But in the case of composition, I think we have a lot to go on. We have, for example, the, dictates of science and, the fact that we appear to be composed macro objects. I mean, there's a lot of evidence in the vicinity or data in the vicinity of this issue. And we just have to kind of do the hard work of going through canvassing that data and then, performing our abductive inference on that data to see if one or the other is in fact motivated, as actually the case, given the way things are around here. I mean, what though, I think there's a more general question in the vicinity of your specific question, which is just that, how is this actually supposed to work with these metaphysical claims? How are we going to go about, in fact, looking at empirical evidence as it would bear on a given metaphysical debate? So it might be clearer for some metaphysical claims than others. So in the case of predurantism, I gave you an example of somebody, namely Sider, who did think that there were empirical considerations that were properly seen as bearing on the actual fact, what's actually the case around here. It may be that for some metaphysical disputes and associated metaphysical claims, it's not clear that there is empirical evidence of that obvious variety that would help us. In that case, we're in that situation where we only have access to the conditionals. However, in the case of composition, again, just to advertise that abduction, I think, is really the way to go here. In the case of composition, I think, maybe my inclination would be to think that maybe not universalism, but the rejection of nihilism. I think there's definitely a good abductive case for that.
Okay. Yeah, I think it is more plausible in certain cases than others. Like, for instance, endurantism versus predurantism. But even in that case, it's not going to settle the dispute between, say, a stage theorist and a worm theorist, because they sort of agree on all the empirical data, and almost all the persistence facts as well. But interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, good point. And I think, I'm working this talk into a paper. I would want to, for sure, go into more detail, maybe with a couple of different cases, and, potentially in a way that illustrates how sometimes you're going to be better situated to, implement metaphysical modal naturalism than or moderate modal naturalism than in some cases, as opposed to others. Look at those kind of, both the positive, so when it just doesn't look like we're going to be able to end up with more than the conditional knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, good, thanks.
Mario?
Thank you. Whether given you have these conditionals that we talked about just also in discussion, but there's a need for you to give up that metaphysical truths are absolutely necessary. Wouldn't there be a way to go where you just say, well, okay, what we are investigating with our methods is these conditionals, and we get all these conditionals. But then, and the problem is we just can't figure out whether our world is like a universals or a tropes world or whatever. But once we have found out what the actual world is, then we found out what the necessity is. And the others just like turn out to be impossible, just as water not being H2O turns out to be impossible.
Yeah.
That's of course not very much 2D, but I don't think you need to assume that alternative metaphysics are actually metaphysically possible or are metaphysically possible.
Well, I don't. So those are not metaphysically possible. So there are, possibilities that are hypothetically arrived at under a false presupposition of a different context, considered as actual or not genuine possibilities. But I still see them as encoding those hypothetical deliberations as encoding the complex space of metaphysical modality such that, it's not just epistemic. These metaphysical principles are in operation, and they are the crucial things that are kind of doing the metaphysical work, such that if, they operate in this such and such context, then the results or associated claim will be metaphysically necessary in the strongest sense that we liked, the sense that we liked. So that's why it's kind of threading the needle here in that sense. So
I took you to be a bit more concessive, I suppose. I took you to be saying, I don't know, but maybe I misunderstood. Like even, I'll give it, I'm okay with a sort of more distant metaphysical possibility of say we are in the universals world. So I'm okay saying like it's possibly possible that there is.
No, I don't want to say that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah. Yeah. I think of a fun application of RMM where that becomes more clear is in Adam Murray's in my first paper, Relativized Metaphysical Modality, where we focus primarily on Chisholm's paradox or Chalmers' paradox, it's developed nicely by Nathan Salmon. And, the question of whether you need to deny 4 or 5 or the associated modal logics S4 and S5. And we argue that you don't. Yeah, because there's this kind of, it's kind of cute to see in the presentations of those paradoxes, so to speak, that there is this shift, we argue, illegitimate shift in context, right? Mm-hmm. Where, before you're considering as counterfactual, and now all of a sudden we're considering as actual, So as we put it there, you can't shift indicatively actual horses in midstream. So once you realize that there's that kind of illegitimate shift is going on, you realize that you're not really violating transitivity, right, of accessibility. Okay. So yeah, it's nice. It's cute. You get to keep your classical logic, no problem.
Oh, very good. So we seem to agree.
Gives you resources for that. Yeah. And then in the second paper with Ben Hellie, where he brought his technical philosophy of language chops to bear, then we kind of tech that up, with the index context distinction in a way that's like formally robust. Yeah, it's fun. Thanks for your question.
Thanks.
Anthony?
Hi. Hey, Jessica. Good to
Hi,
see you.
I see you
Thanks for
too.
that.
Hi, Tony. Great to see you.
I think I'm on board with a lot of what you're saying. I mean, and I was tempted by, it's not something I'm particularly fond of, but it's come up and when I'm thinking about properties and universals. And what I'm thinking of is Barry Stroud's book on metaphysical disappointment. Um, the thought is that so he gives a sort of cogito argument for certain
Mhm.
things, like you cannot do without various things. I think he would say um, the the property metaphysics is one of those things. You know, if you're going to have any kind of inquiry at all, you're presupposing something about properties or whatever
Okay.
universals, something like that. So
Interesting.
yeah, so I'm just sort of curious, what do you think about that?
Um, yeah, so I don't know. I haven't read his book, so I'm just gonna be upfront about that. But is the idea that um, a lot of our theorizing is going to be presupposing some or other specific metaphysics?
Yeah, that seems to be what he would have been tempted
hmm
by. Yeah.
hmm And if it does, is that so? How do you see that bearing on the project here?
Well, I'm not actually sure, but I mean, I can imagine somebody saying, wait a minute, relativized metaphysics is not going to work because we have to understand that we're presupposing one thing. Um,
hmm
um,
I see. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, that just sounds like we are I mean, so according to me, we are presupposing one thing. I mean, well, in the sense that it can't all be true,
Okay.
right? Incompatible
Yeah,
claims can't be true.
sure. Yeah.
Um, I was hoping by appeal to, in the first case of resistance, so abduction might give you the resources to justify your presupposition, right, of one
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you do that work. Now, people might wrongly presuppose something that at the end of the day, it turns out we should reject, but that, that's just our usual unfortunate state. We're pretty far from the end of empirical inquiry. And by the way, just tangentially, I just feel like we're really just such kids in the playground at this point. We just got started, really. Even if you think about the longest philosophical traditions, it's, it's like, I don't know, couple, what at most, 15,000 years, I think. So anyway, we're just getting started here, but I think we made a lot of progress. So, we have to give ourselves a break sometimes under circumstances where we're still disagreeing or we might not get it right. That's fine. But resistance, understood as applying abduction to these questions, that could provide you with one route to supporting Stroud's supposition, right? So that's fine.
Okay.
And then the other one, though, the metaphysical, like appeal to RMM, relativized metaphysical modality, that would too, in the sense that RMM is, I think, is compatible and may even also presuppose that there's just only one way that these things can be. Again, if they're genuinely incompatible, there no context is going to
Okay.
support the incompatible metaphysical claim. So it's just supposed to be a way of making sense of why you might have thought that these incompatible claims were equally possible and hence somehow actual or per impossibile actual or problematically supposed to be
Okay.
both actual. So I think actually we would be friendly to Stroud's suppositions there.
Okay. Sounds
But
good.
yeah, I'll have to look at that more closely. But thanks for that. I think that's a nice point that could provide maybe at the end, if I'm right, further support for the view or the views strategies. Cool.
Mike?
If nobody else has another question, well, I was wondering, it doesn't seem like there's anything special about metaphysical claims. So you can imagine another world in which people are justified via reliable processes, but in another world. So like even epistemic or moral or whatever claims, you could use this relativized strategy for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. Yeah. As far as the for sure moral claims, I think that's true. Epistemic claims, it might depend on whether the epistemic value of the claim was a priori or not. I mean, of the procedure was a priori or not. But yeah, in general, I think that would
Right.
that's true. Yeah. And maybe in a fuller exposition, like a book-length treatment, it would be nice to expand even beyond the focus on kind of the standard metaphysical claims to other areas.
Yeah, but I think what's nice about the metaphysical cases is that you do have cases where, for instance, with persistence, like relativity supports one view over another, or in the case of logic, maybe quantum stuff
Exactly. Yeah.
supports one logic over another, or monism over the many or whatever. But yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It may be less clear what the empirical, sort of input would be that would at one moral theory rather than another. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'd have to think more about that, though. Would be worth thinking about, though.
Thank you.
Thank you.
G-Day?
Yeah, hi Jessica. Thank you so much for your talk. I am a PhD student at Free University of Berlin.
Great.
I have this question. So, I'm wondering that if we know the every details of the actual world, it is still not enough to determine the set of the possible worlds that are relevant to us, so that we still have some indeterminacy of our model judgment. And I cannot think about an example about metaphysical possibility, but I can think of the examples in morality or also in causation. So, for example, if I throw a rock and it breaks a bottle, and if I do not consider
Sorry, could you repeat can you talk less slowly?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, less quickly. So your case is what?
Yeah, my case is about causation. So if I throw a rock and it breaks a bottle, so if we do not consider those preemption scenarios, then it is clear that my throwing of the rock causes the bottle breaks. But if we can consider those preemption scenarios as relevant, then our counterfactual change, the truth value of the counterfactual changes, and also our judgment of the causation is indeterminate. So I'm wondering that even if we know all the details in the actual world, it is still not enough to tell us that what possible worlds are relevant. And if that is the case, then would it be the case that some strategies or some sets of the relevant possible worlds are on the par and we cannot get our answer?
Yeah, very interesting. Well, my claim is not that all the everything is sort of determined by just the actual facts, and counterfactual facts don't have any import. That's all fine. That's all just, by the way, that's just relative to a single actual world context. So, whatever is going on with counterfactuals and stuff along the horizontal dimension where we consider other worlds as counterfactual, that would all, our view is neutral on that. So if it turns out to be indeterminacy that's associated with certain kinds of claims that involve counterfactual deliberation, then okay, I guess, yeah, there would be such indeterminacy. As for metaphysical claims in general, it hasn't been. I'm trying to think of cases where maybe the counterfactual deliberation would kind of indicate that there wasn't a metaphysical fact of the matter. There probably are cases. So, yeah. I mean, nothing in this apparatus is going to tell you which claims are metaphysically true or are true, which metaphysical claims are true or metaphysically necessary. So that's just going to be, you do your metaphysics as usual, just like you do your causation as usual, and, see what results. Yeah. I'm a fan of indeterminacy anyway, metaphysical indeterminacy. So if that enters into certain kinds of, metaphysical states of affairs, so be it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Maya?
Hello, hi.
Hello there.
You don't hear me? You hear me? Yes. Okay, I was wondering, so the beginning, why we got into this metaphysical skepticism, the problem was that we had these opposing claims, and our methods were saying that both could be true. And now you put this relativized metaphysics, where you say, given this context, this is true, given this is true. So doesn't the problem reappear? So which is our context? Is it not, again, the same problem? I don't see that it made any big difference.
Well, the problem originally was that because sorry about that, the bearing of, let me turn this on. The bearing of metaphysical truth on context was not taken into account, then the skeptics or the people, like the considerations that were motivating there being some kind of skepticism due to overdetermination, were taking those like the intuitions or the conceivings or whatever to be on a par such that they were both possible, and so both actual, given that they're metaphysical claims. So then that would give rise to, the world blowing up due to contradiction or whatever, right? So if you introduce context dependence, then you are not going to end up with that same problem. Now, you then are observing that then the question arises of, well, which context are we in, right? And there are these various strategies that I've offered, but I grant that we may, in some cases, not be in position to know which context we're in. So then at that case, that's the case where at best we can just know these conditionals. But my claim is that it looks like metaphysicians, anyway, are standardly assuming that, first of all, empirical data can enter into metaphysical theory choice in such a way as to support one over another. So that would be one way of knowing what context we are in, is if empirical data could bear on our metaphysical claims. So that's kind of an advantage of the view from the perspective of answering your question, is that it makes room for empirical considerations to narrow the field of possibilities so that we would then end up knowing, oh, okay, I guess we're in a universals world. That's one way. The other way would be if we are able to arrive at one theory as being really overall a priori, the only viable option. That was the resistance strategy. In that case, though, you're not going to have variation across different contexts, right? So if I implement my first resistance strategy and I use inference to the best explanation, operating on broadly a priori data to arrive at the view that the best explanation of the resemblance facts is immanent universals, then, I should think under those circumstances that in every context, actual world context, so that would be a kind of a case where those other incompatible metaphysical accounts of resemblance turn out not to be viable, even if conceivable, right? So that's one strategy, just rule out all the competitors using abduction. Another strategy is to appeal to actual empirical data. And if you're lucky, that data bears upon your metaphysical theorizing in a way to tell you which actual world context you're in. And so you will be able to know if you are in a universals world or whatever. And then the third option, so to speak, is if we can't either abduction operating on a priori data or abduction operating on a priori and a posteriori data, we can't narrow the field, then we're stuck with the conditionals. But the conditional, given RMM, we're not committed to, we can still, just like Barry Strutt, I guess I was thinking about, the idea that we presuppose that one of these is true, RMM is compatible with that. So even if we only have we have the conditional knowledge, we're not thereby committed to being able to discharge more than one antecedent, right? It's not like it is the case that universals and tropes are both in this world the basis for resemblance between particulars. So the third strategy, where you don't know which context you're in, you just know you have all this conditional metaphysical knowledge. Having that conditional metaphysical knowledge doesn't commit you to the claim that the incompatible metaphysical claims are all possibly true. So you avoid contradiction. So that's an advance. So I think each of these different kind of dialectical lines of thought offer advances over the initial state we were in when Chalmers and Rosen and Clarke-Doane were suggesting that we were in a really bad situation where basically metaphysical contradictions are true.
Well, I mean, in that first case, it was the problem of that we don't know what is the right method in arriving this metaphysical truth. So that's why if you don't know it's one true or the other, you can't say which is necessarily false or which is necessarily true. And then you introduced context. I don't see that this was solved because you actually added this empirical way of achieving results. And still, we don't know which context is really our context. And just if I may, that illustration that you had with if our world is H2O world, then this. If our world is XYZ world, then this.
Yeah.
I was feeling that here it's missing. If our world is world in which water is transparent liquid that we found in the rivers, because how do we know that constitution is essential for water? This is that thing that we don't know. This is the that a priori stuff that we have to bring from somewhere.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with respect to that example, I was just saying, a lot of people take that for granted that we do have, we can a priori know that the constitution of these natural kinds is essential to them. If you don't agree with that, or you think there's an in-principle problem with arriving at that kind of knowledge, that is a very good question or topic or whatever. But, here I'm just assuming that we could. So that wasn't it wasn't my goal here to try to argue that we, to resolve that kind of skepticism. So with respect to Chalmers and Rosen and Clarke-Doane, they are not assuming that there's indeterminacy in the methodology. They were assuming that we did know how to arrive at answers to these metaphysical questions. But then the problem is those same methods seem to overgenerate. So I think you're raising a different sort of question than they are. Also a very good question, but like if you think that in fact there was a kind of we don't have that's more like in my view that would be like the underdetermination route to metaphysical skepticism, and I have a separate paper in progress on that. So I would probably like to talk to you more about that. But that that's a different kind of concern where we just are not in position to arrive at answers, or don't know which, we don't even know how we would go about proceeding. So that's a good question, but it was a different kind of skepticism and deserves a separate treatment, I think. Yeah, thanks.
All right, I think we're running out of time. So unless there is no more teeny tiny question. Okay, so let me thank Jessica again for a fantastic talk. Thank you all for coming, and I hope I'll see you later. Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody. I really enjoyed your questions and comments. Thanks.